The three bullies thought they had cornered an easy target when they tried to lift the shy transfer student's skirt in the abandoned gymnasium. But within seconds, they were writhing on the floor as the quiet girl they'd been tormenting revealed herself to be a three-time national boxing champion who had been holding back her devastating power for months. 17-year-old Sophia Chen had perfected the art of invisibility during her first month at Clearwater Academy, a prestigious private school nestled in the rolling hills of Northern California. Standing barely 5 feet 3 inches tall with her slight frame hidden beneath oversized cardigans and her long black hair perpetually arranged in a messy bun, she looked more like someone who spent her afternoons in the library than someone who could deliver a knockout punch that would make professional fighters wince. Her family had relocated from Chicago after her mother accepted a lucrative position as head of pediatric surgery at the regional medical center, forcing Sophia to leave behind not only her friends and familiar surroundings, but also the boxing gym where she had trained religiously since the age of 9. What her new classmates couldn't have known was that Sophia Chen was boxing royalty in disguise. Her grandfather had been a legendary trainer in Hong Kong. Her father had competed in the Olympics before a shoulder injury ended his career, and Sophia herself had been destined for greatness from the moment she first stepped into a ring. By age 12, she was already outboxing opponents 3 years older than her. By 15, she had earned her first national championship title in the junior division. By 16, she had accumulated an impressive record of 47 wins and only 2 losses, with 31 of those victories coming by way of knockout. Her signature move, a devastating left hook that her trainer called the Phantom, had earned her respect and fear in equal measure throughout the competitive boxing circuit. The decision to keep her boxing background secret had been deliberate and painful. Her parents, both successful professionals who valued education above all else, had insisted that her new school experience focus entirely on academics and college preparation. They worried that her reputation as a fighter would overshadow her intellectual achievements and potentially create unnecessary drama in the sophisticated social environment of Clearwater Academy. Sophia's mother, Dr. Lisa Chen, had made it abundantly clear that any fighting incidents at school would result in the immediate termination of her boxing career and enrollment in a strict boarding school across the country. The threat carried weight because Dr. Chen had already sacrificed her own promising research career twice to accommodate her husband's boxing ambitions, and later to support Sophia's training schedule. Sophia's father, Marcus Chen, understood his daughter's frustration better than anyone. He had experienced the same struggle during his own competitive years, learning to navigate social situations where his fighting ability had to remain hidden to avoid unnecessary confrontations. He had taught Sophia that true strength wasn't about proving her dominance over others, but about having the discipline to control her power and use it only when absolutely necessary. This philosophy had served her well throughout her boxing career, where she was known as much for her sportsmanship and respect for opponents as for her devastating technique inside the ring. The architecture of Clearwater Academy itself seemed designed to intimidate newcomers. The main building, constructed in the early 1900s from imported limestone, featured soaring ceilings, ornate woodwork, and portraits of distinguished alumni who had gone on to become senators, CEOs, and Nobel Prize winners. The student body consisted primarily of children from wealthy families who had attended the school for generations, creating an insular social hierarchy that was nearly impossible for outsiders to penetrate. Sophia's modest background and public school education made her an immediate target for subtle forms of exclusion that were perfected by teenagers who had grown up in an environment of privilege and entitlement. Her daily routine had become a carefully choreographed dance of avoidance and strategic positioning. She arrived at school exactly 7 minutes before the first bell, timing her entrance to avoid the social clusters that formed in the main hallway. Her locker, assigned in the less desirable section near the gymnasium, actually suited her purposes perfectly because it kept her away from the prime real estate near the main entrance where the popular students congregated. During lunch periods, she found sanctuary in the music practice rooms, claiming she needed quiet space to study while actually using the time to visualize boxing combinations and maintain her mental connection to the sport she missed desperately. The irony of her situation wasn't lost on her. Here she was, someone who had faced down opponents who could bench press twice her body weight, feeling genuinely nervous about navigating a high school cafeteria. The same hands that had learned to move with lightning speed and precision now trembled slightly when she had to raise them to answer questions in class. The same voice that had confidently called out combinations to sparring partners now barely rose above a whisper when she was forced to participate in group discussions. The transformation from confident athlete to anxious teenager was so complete that sometimes she wondered if her boxing achievements had been nothing more than elaborate dreams. Her academic performance provided the only bright spot in an otherwise challenging transition. The discipline and focus she had developed through years of rigorous training translated perfectly to her studies, and she quickly established herself as one of the top students in her advanced placement classes. Her teachers, particularly Mrs. Rodriguez in AP Literature and Mr. Patterson in Advanced Chemistry, seemed to recognize her potential and made subtle efforts to encourage her participation. However, their well-intentioned attempts to draw her out only served to attract more attention from classmates, who were already suspicious of the quiet newcomer who consistently scored at the top of every exam. The weight of maintaining her secret identity was exhausting in ways she hadn't anticipated. Every instinct honed through years of training screamed at her to stand tall, move with confidence, and project the quiet authority that had made her a natural leader in the boxing community. Instead, she forced herself to hunch her shoulders, avoid eye contact, and literally make herself smaller in every possible way. The physical toll of constantly fighting against her natural posture and movement patterns left her with chronic neck and back pain that she couldn't explain to the school nurse without revealing too much about her athletic background. Her mother's busy schedule at the hospital meant that Sophia often spent evenings alone in their new house, a modern construction in a gated community that felt sterile and unwelcoming compared to their old neighborhood in Chicago. She would stand in front of the full-length mirror in her bedroom, shadowboxing through the combinations that had once been as natural as breathing, trying to maintain some connection to the person she used to be. The silence of the empty house amplified her sense of isolation, and she found herself counting down the days until graduation when she could finally reclaim her identity and return to competitive boxing. The few attempts she had made to connect with other students had been met with polite but distant responses that made it clear she wasn't welcome in their established social circles. The girls in her classes were friendly enough during group projects, but their conversations invariably turned to topics that required shared cultural references she didn't possess: family vacations to European capitals, summer internships at their parents' companies, college application strategies that assumed unlimited financial resources and family connections. Their world was so fundamentally different from her own that she felt like an anthropologist studying an alien culture rather than a teenager trying to make friends. The boys at Clearwater Academy presented a different but equally challenging dynamic. Many of them had been athletes in middle school before focusing entirely on academics, and something about Sophia's controlled way of moving seemed to trigger their curiosity. She had caught several of them watching her with expressions that suggested they sensed something different about her, but couldn't quite identify what it was. Their instinctive recognition of a fellow athlete made her even more paranoid about maintaining her cover, leading to increasingly awkward interactions that only reinforced her reputation as the weird, quiet girl who didn't fit in anywhere. As the weeks passed and the isolation deepened, Sophia began to question whether the sacrifice was worth it. Her parents' intentions were good, but they couldn't understand the psychological toll of denying such a fundamental part of her identity. Boxing wasn't just what she did. It was who she was. Every day spent pretending to be someone else felt like a betrayal of the grandfather who had taught her that fighting was an art form, the father who had shown her that strength came from discipline, and the younger version of herself who had dreamed of Olympic gold and professional championships. The morning that would change everything started like any other, with Sophia arriving at school precisely 7 minutes before the first bell and making her way to her locker through the mostly empty hallways. She had no way of knowing that 3 students had been watching her routine for weeks, planning something that would shatter her carefully constructed facade and force her to choose between maintaining her secret and protecting herself from a humiliation that would follow her for the rest of her high school career. The boxing legacy that ran through Sophia's veins was as much a part of her DNA as her dark eyes and determined jawline. Her journey into sweet science had begun at age 9 in a cramped gymnasium above a Chinese restaurant in Chicago's Chinatown, where her grandfather, Chen Wei-ming, had established himself as one of the most respected trainers on the amateur circuit. The old man had fled mainland China in the 1960s with nothing but his knowledge of traditional martial arts and an unshakable belief that discipline could overcome any obstacle life presented. Chen Wei-ming had been a formidable fighter in his youth, though his achievements were largely undocumented due to the political upheaval of his era. What remained were stories passed down through family members and faded photographs showing a lean young man with hands wrapped in cloth, standing victorious over opponents in makeshift rings. When he arrived in America, he discovered that his traditional fighting style needed adaptation to succeed in Western boxing. So he spent years studying film footage of great champions, breaking down their techniques, and developing a hybrid approach that combined Eastern philosophy with Western boxing fundamentals. The transition from traditional martial arts to boxing hadn't been easy for the elder Chen. He struggled with the English language and cultural differences that made it difficult to connect with potential students. Many established boxing gyms viewed him with suspicion, seeing his methods as unconventional and his quiet demeanor as weakness. However, his persistence eventually paid off when a local boxing promoter noticed the incredible conditioning and technical precision of the few fighters he was training. Word spread through the underground boxing community about the mysterious Chinese trainer who could transform raw talent into polished fighters using methods no one quite understood. Sophia's father, Marcus, had been Wei-ming's greatest success story and most heartbreaking failure. As a teenager, Marcus possessed all the physical tools necessary for boxing greatness: lightning-fast reflexes, devastating punching power, and an iron chin that seemed impervious to punishment. Under his father's tutelage, he developed into one of the most promising amateur boxers in the Midwest, winning regional championships and eventually earning a spot on the United States Olympic team. His signature combination, a rapid-fire series of body shots followed by a devastating uppercut, became legendary among those who witnessed it firsthand. The shoulder injury that ended Marcus's career happened during a routine sparring session just months before the Olympics. A seemingly minor collision with a training partner resulted in torn ligaments and nerve damage that robbed him of the explosive power that had made him special. 3 surgeries and 2 years of rehabilitation couldn't restore what had been lost, and Marcus was forced to accept that his competitive fighting days were over before his 22nd birthday. The psychological toll of watching his Olympic dreams evaporate was almost harder to bear than the physical pain, and for several years, he struggled with depression and a sense of purposelessness that worried his family deeply. The healing process began when Marcus met Lisa, a brilliant medical student who was volunteering at the clinic that treated his shoulder injury. She possessed the rare combination of intellectual brilliance and emotional intelligence that allowed her to see past his disappointment and recognize the strength of character that his boxing career had forged. Their courtship was unconventional, taking place primarily in hospital waiting rooms and physical therapy sessions, but their connection was undeniable. Lisa challenged Marcus to channel his competitive drive into new pursuits, while he taught her about the discipline and mental toughness required to excel at the highest levels of any endeavor. When Sophia was born, both parents were determined that she would have opportunities they had never enjoyed. Lisa's successful medical career provided financial stability, while Marcus found purpose in coaching at his father's gym and studying exercise physiology to better understand the science behind athletic performance. They had no intention of pushing their daughter into boxing, but Sophia's natural athleticism and fearless personality made it inevitable that she would gravitate toward physical challenges. Her first exposure to boxing came during family visits to Wei Ming's gym, where she would sit quietly in the corner while her father worked with other fighters. Even as a small child, she was mesmerized by the rhythmic sound of gloves hitting heavy bags and the complex footwork patterns that turned fighting into something resembling dance. When she was 7, she began mimicking the movements she observed, shadowboxing in front of mirrors and practicing combinations with an intensity that surprised the adults around her. Wei Ming was the first to recognize that Sophia possessed something special. Unlike many children who were drawn to boxing for its aggressive aspects, she seemed to understand instinctively that the sport was about strategy, timing, and precision rather than brute force. Her natural stance was textbook perfect, her balance was exceptional, and her hand-eye coordination was so advanced that she could hit targets consistently while blindfolded. Most importantly, she possessed the mental discipline necessary to learn from criticism and make adjustments without becoming discouraged. The decision to allow Sophia to train seriously wasn't made lightly. Marcus and Lisa spent months discussing the potential risks and benefits, consulting with sports medicine specialists, and researching the long-term effects of boxing training on developing brains. They established strict guidelines that prioritize her safety and education above competitive success, insisting that her grades remain perfect and that any signs of head trauma would result in immediate retirement from the sport. These conditions might have deterred other children, but Sophia embraced them as challenges to overcome rather than limitations to resent. Her training regimen under Wei Ming's supervision was unlike anything being practiced at conventional boxing gyms. The old man believed that traditional Western boxing had lost touch with the mental and spiritual aspects that made fighting an art form rather than mere violence. Sophia's sessions began with meditation and breathing exercises designed to center her mind and connect her with her body's natural rhythms. Only after achieving this state of mental clarity would she begin the physical training that would transform her into a formidable fighter. The technical instruction was methodical and uncompromising. Wei Ming insisted that every movement be executed with perfect form before adding power or speed, a philosophy that sometimes frustrated Sophia, but ultimately gave her a technical foundation that was superior to fighters who had trained for much longer. Her jab was taught as a precise instrument for measuring distance and setting up combinations rather than a power punch. Her footwork was developed through endless repetitions of movement patterns that kept her in perfect balance while creating angles for attack and defense. Conditioning was perhaps the most challenging aspect of her training. Wei Ming believed that mental toughness was more important than physical strength, so Sophia's workouts were designed to push her beyond her perceived limitations and teach her that she could endure more than she believed possible. Road work began before dawn regardless of weather conditions, building not only cardiovascular endurance, but also the psychological resilience necessary to perform when circumstances were less than ideal. Weight training focused on functional strength and injury prevention rather than building impressive muscles that might actually slow her down in the ring. The philosophical aspects of her education were equally important to Wei Ming. He taught Sophia that boxing was a conversation between opponents, conducted through movement and timing, rather than a violent confrontation between enemies. Victory was to be pursued with respect for one's opponent and humility about one's own abilities. The goal wasn't to hurt people, but to demonstrate superior skill and preparation through clean, technical boxing that left no doubt about the outcome. This mindset would later serve her well when she was forced to use her abilities outside the controlled environment of sanctioned competition. Sparring sessions were carefully controlled affairs that prioritized safety and learning over ego satisfaction. Sophia was matched with partners who could challenge her skills without overwhelming her with size or experience advantages. Wei Ming insisted that every round be analyzed afterward, with both fighters discussing what they had learned and how they could improve. This approach developed Sophia's boxing IQ at an accelerated rate, teaching her to think strategically during exchanges and adapt her tactics based on her opponent's tendencies. The competitive circuit that Sophia entered as a junior boxer was a revelation to everyone who witnessed her fights. Her technical precision and ring intelligence were years ahead of her chronological age, but what truly set her apart was her composure under pressure. While other young fighters became emotional and abandoned their training when facing adversity, Sophia remained calm and methodical, working her way out of difficult situations through superior boxing skills rather than desperate aggression. Her victory celebrations were as controlled as her fighting style, with respectful acknowledgement of her opponents and credit given to her trainers and family. The 3 national championships she earned were the result of years of sacrifice that extended far beyond the hours spent in the gymnasium. Social activities were limited to accommodate training schedules. Dietary restrictions were maintained year-round to stay in fighting condition, and academic performance had to remain exemplary to satisfy her parents' conditions for continued participation. The discipline required to maintain this lifestyle would have broken many teenagers, but Sophia thrived on the structure and purpose it provided. The decision to keep her boxing background secret at Clearwater Academy represented the most difficult challenge she had ever faced, requiring her to deny the accomplishments and identity that had defined her for most of her conscious life. The young woman who had stood in ring centers accepting championship trophies was now pretending to be intimidated by high school hallways, and the psychological toll of this deception was becoming harder to bear with each passing day. She had no way of knowing that her carefully constructed facade was about to be tested in ways that would force her to choose between maintaining her secret and protecting herself from an assault that would change everything. The 3 students who would eventually make the catastrophic mistake of targeting Sophia Chen were products of Clearwater Academy's most toxic social dynamics, each bringing their own blend of privilege, insecurity, and carefully cultivated cruelty to their unofficial reign of terror over anyone they perceived as vulnerable. Their leader, 18-year-old Trevor Blackwood, stood 6 feet, 2 inches tall with the kind of naturally athletic build that had made him a star on the lacrosse field before academic probation forced him to focus on maintaining his grades rather than pursuing sports glory. His sandy blonde hair was always perfectly styled. His expensive clothing was chosen to project casual wealth, and his confident smile masked a deeply insecure personality that required constant validation through the domination of others. Trevor's family background provided both the resources and the psychological framework that had shaped him into a predator. His father, Richard Blackwood, was a prominent corporate attorney who had built his career on aggressive litigation tactics and a willingness to destroy opponents through any means necessary. The Blackwood family had attended Clearwater Academy for 3 generations, and Trevor grew up hearing stories about how his grandfather and father had used their school years to establish the social connections that would later prove invaluable in their professional lives. This legacy created enormous pressure for Trevor to maintain the family's reputation for dominance, even as his own limitations became increasingly apparent. The cracks in Trevor's facade had begun to show during his junior year when his grades slipped dramatically due to a combination of academic overconfidence and a social schedule that prioritized parties over studying. His parents' reaction to his first semester of C's and D's was swift and merciless, involving the withdrawal of his car privileges, the cancellation of his credit cards, and most devastatingly for his social status, the removal of his lacrosse team membership until his grades improved. The humiliation of being publicly disciplined while his younger accomplices maintained their positions on various sports teams created a reservoir of rage that Trevor channeled into increasingly cruel behavior towards students who couldn't fight back. Trevor's primary lieutenant in their harassment campaigns was 16-year-old Madison, whose petite frame and angelic appearance provided perfect camouflage for a personality that delighted in psychological cruelty. Standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall with platinum blonde hair and blue eyes that could project innocence or malice depending on her audience, Madison had perfected the art of plausible deniability when it came to bullying behavior. Her family's wealth came from real estate development, and she had grown up watching her mother use social manipulation and strategic gossip to destroy business competitors and personal rivals. Madison's role in their group dynamic was that of the strategist, the one who identified potential targets and developed plans for breaking them down psychologically before Trevor and their third member moved in for more direct confrontation. She possessed an almost supernatural ability to detect insecurities and vulnerabilities in other students, filing away information about family problems, academic struggles, and social awkwardness that could later be weaponized when they decided to target someone. Her own insecurities centered around her academic performance, which was barely adequate despite expensive tutoring and her parents' frequent donations to the school. The third member of their toxic triangle was 17-year-old Connor Walsh, a stocky redhead whose family had achieved wealth through a chain of successful restaurants, but who felt constantly inferior to his more socially prominent companions. Connor's role was typically that of the enforcer, using his wrestling background and natural aggression to intimidate targets. Once Madison had identified their weaknesses and Trevor had provided strategic direction. His participation in their bullying campaigns was motivated partly by his desire to maintain his position in their social hierarchy and partly by genuine anger at a world that seemed to value breeding and connections over the hard work that had elevated his family from working-class origins. Connor's psychological profile was perhaps the most complex of the three, as his working-class background had given him genuine insight into the struggles faced by students from less privileged families. Yet his desperate need for acceptance among Clearwater's elite had corrupted this empathy into its opposite. He was often the most vicious in his attacks on scholarship students and middle-class transfers, as if proving his worthiness to belong among the wealthy required him to demonstrate complete rejection of his own humble origins. This internal conflict manifested in unpredictable mood swings that made him dangerous to anyone who triggered his insecurities about class and social status. The three had found each other during Trevor's sophomore year when a mutual detention session revealed their shared enjoyment of making other students uncomfortable. What began as casual cruelty directed at obvious targets like the school's handful of scholarship students gradually evolved into a sophisticated system for identifying and destroying anyone who failed to show them appropriate deference. Their methods were refined through trial and error, with each successful campaign teaching them new techniques for psychological manipulation, while reinforcing their sense of superiority over their victims. Their hunting ground was the labyrinthine structure of Clearwater Academy itself, a building that had grown organically over more than a century through additions and renovations that created countless secluded areas perfect for confrontations away from adult supervision. The original limestone structure from the early 1900s featured high ceilings and formal architectural details that projected dignity and tradition, But the various modern additions had created blind spots and isolated corridors that the administration struggled to monitor effectively. The trio had mapped these areas methodically, identifying locations where they could corner targets without fear of interruption. The gymnasium complex was their favorite hunting ground, particularly the older auxiliary gym that was used primarily for storage and occasional wrestling practice. This building, constructed in the 1960s with more utilitarian concerns than the main academy, featured long hallways with minimal lighting and multiple exits that could be blocked easily by positioning themselves strategically. The acoustic properties of the building meant that sounds didn't carry far, while the irregular schedule of activities made it unlikely that teachers or other students would interrupt their activities unexpectedly. Their targeting system was based on a combination of vulnerability assessment and opportunity evaluation that would have impressed military strategists. Madison typically conducted the initial reconnaissance, gathering intelligence about potential victims through careful observation of social dynamics, academic performance, and family circumstances. She paid particular attention to new students, scholarship recipients, and anyone whose behavior suggested they were trying to avoid attention or hide aspects of their background. This information was compiled into informal profiles that helped them predict how targets might react to different types of pressure. Trevor contributed strategic oversight in final targeting decisions, weighing factors like the potential for retaliation, the likelihood of adult intervention, and the social capital to be gained from successful campaigns. His experience with lacrosse had given him tactical thinking skills that translated surprisingly well to psychological warfare, and he insisted on maintaining operational security that protected them from official consequences. His family's legal connections had also taught him exactly how far they could push without crossing lines that would result in serious disciplinary action or criminal charges. Connor's role involved the practical implementation of their plans, using his physical presence and wrestling skills to create intimidating situations that forced compliance from their targets. His background in competitive wrestling had taught him how to use leverage and positioning to control opponents without leaving obvious evidence of assault, knowledge that proved invaluable when they needed to physically corner someone without creating witnesses who could testify to clear-cut violence. His anger management issues also made him effective at projecting genuine menace that convinced targets their situations could escalate dramatically if they resisted. The evolution of their methods over 2 years had created a sophisticated playbook for breaking down student resistance through escalating pressure campaigns. They typically began with subtle social isolation tactics, using their influence to exclude targets from group activities and spread rumors that damaged reputations. These preliminary attacks served both to weaken their victims psychologically and to test whether anyone in authority would intervene on the target's behalf. Students who survived this initial phase without support faced escalation to more direct harassment. The intermediate phase involved calculated public humiliation designed to establish clear dominance while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. They excelled at creating situations where their behavior could be interpreted as accidental or playful by casual observers, while being clearly threatening to their intended victims. Lunchroom incidents where food was spilled accidentally, hallway collisions that sent books flying, and pointed comments made just loudly enough to be heard were all part of their standard repertoire during this phase. The final phase, reserved for targets who refused to submit, involved direct confrontation in controlled environments where they could operate without interference. These encounters were carefully planned to maximize psychological impact while minimizing their exposure to official consequences. The auxiliary gymnasium had hosted dozens of these final confrontations over the past 2 years, with victims typically choosing to transfer schools rather than report incidents that they knew would be difficult to prove and might result in even worse retaliation. Their success rate was nearly perfect, with only one target ever successfully resisting their campaign long enough to attract meaningful adult intervention. This lone failure had occurred when they targeted the daughter of a prominent alumni family whose parents had sufficient influence to threaten the administration with consequences for allowing harassment to continue. The experience had taught them to research family backgrounds more carefully before proceeding with final phase operations, but it had also reinforced their confidence that most students lacked the resources or connections necessary to fight back effectively. Sophia Chen's profile had attracted their attention during her second week at Clearwater Academy when Madison noticed her deliberate efforts to avoid social interaction and her obvious discomfort in group settings. Her modest clothing and careful behavior suggested a middle-class background that would provide no protection from administrative pressure, while her academic excellence made her a valuable target whose destruction would demonstrate their power over merit-based achievement. Most importantly, her small physical stature and apparent timidity suggested she would be easily intimidated. Once they moved beyond preliminary harassment tactics, the decision to target Sophia represented a convergence of opportunity and psychological need that made the campaign feel inevitable to all three participants. Trevor was still stinging from his academic humiliation and needed a high-profile victory to restore his social credibility. Madison was threatened by Sophia's obvious intelligence and wanted to demonstrate that academic achievement meant nothing without social connections. Connor saw an opportunity to prove his loyalty to the group while working out his frustrations about his own precarious position in Clearwater's social hierarchy. None of them had any way of knowing that their carefully selected victim possessed skills that could end their reign of terror in a matter of seconds, or that their final confrontation would become a cautionary tale about the dangers of mistaking restraint for weakness. The first encounter between Sophia and her future tormentors occurred on a Tuesday morning during the chaotic period between second and third periods when students rushed through the hallways to reach their next classes before the tardy bell. Sophia had been walking toward her advanced chemistry classroom, her backpack slung over one shoulder and her eyes focused on the floor to avoid unwanted social interaction, when Trevor deliberately stepped into her path near the intersection of the main hallway and the science wing corridor. The collision was carefully orchestrated to appear accidental while ensuring maximum disruption to Sophia's routine and dignity. The impact sent Sophia's carefully organized binder flying open, scattering her meticulously maintained notes and homework assignments across the polished marble floor in a cascade of white paper that drew immediate attention from passing students. Her mechanical pencils rolled in different directions, and her calculator bounced twice before coming to rest near the trophy case that displayed decades of Clearwater Academy's academic and athletic achievements. The scene was perfectly designed to create the kind of public embarrassment that would establish the power dynamic Trevor intended while providing him with plausible deniability about his intentions. "Oh wow, I'm so sorry," Trevor said with exaggerated concern, his voice loud enough to attract additional attention from students who might otherwise have continued past the minor commotion. His tone carried just enough insincerity to make it clear to Sophia that the collision had been intentional while remaining ambiguous enough that any teachers who might inquire later would hear only an appropriate apology. "I totally didn't see you there. You're so quiet, it's like you're invisible or something." Sophia knelt immediately to gather her scattered belongings, her face burning with embarrassment as other students stepped around her and occasionally over her papers without offering assistance. Her boxing training had conditioned her to assess threats automatically, and every instinct was screaming warnings about Trevor's body language and positioning. The way he stood over her while she scrambled to collect her things was a classic dominance display, designed to establish hierarchy through physical intimidation. Her hands trembled slightly as she stuffed papers back into her binder, not from fear but from the enormous effort required to suppress her natural inclination to stand up and confront the obvious challenge. Madison Pierce materialized beside Trevor with the kind of perfect timing that suggested coordination, her innocent expression masking the calculating intelligence that was already cataloging Sophia's reactions for future reference. "Are you okay, sweetie?" she asked in a voice that dripped with false sympathy. "You look really shaken up. Maybe you should be more careful about where you're walking. These hallways can be dangerous if you're not paying attention." The subtle, victim-blaming in Madison's comment was delivered with such practiced skill that it would have sounded like genuine concern to any adult who might have overheard the exchange. However, Sophia recognized the manipulation immediately, having witnessed similar psychological tactics during her years in competitive boxing where opponents sometimes tried to gain mental advantages through verbal intimidation and mind games. The difference was that in boxing, such behavior was expected and could be answered with physical action. Here, she was trapped by social conventions and her parents' threats that required her to accept humiliation without response. Connor Walsh completed their formation by positioning himself slightly behind and to the left of Trevor, creating a triangle that effectively boxed Sophia into the corner where the two hallways met. His wrestling background had taught him about controlling space and cutting off escape routes, though he applied these skills unconsciously rather than through deliberate tactical planning. His presence added physical menace to the encounter while maintaining the appearance of casual conversation that would deflect suspicion from any faculty members who might notice the gathering. "You're the new girl, right?" Connor asked, though his tone made it clear that the question was rhetorical and designed to emphasize Sophia's outsider status rather than gather information. "Transfer student from somewhere in the Midwest?" "Chicago." "Maybe. It must be hard adjusting to a place like Clearwater after wherever you came from. Different class of people here, if you know what I mean." The comment about class differences was calculated to probe Sophia's socioeconomic background while simultaneously asserting the superiority that came with generational wealth and social connections. Connor's own insecurities about his family's relatively recent acquisition of wealth made him particularly vicious when discussing class distinctions, as if demonstrating his understanding of social hierarchies would convince others that he truly belonged among Clearwater's elite families. His emphasis on the phrase "different class of people" was designed to make Sophia feel unwelcome and inferior. Sophia finished gathering her scattered belongings and stood slowly, her movements controlled and deliberate despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Her grandfather's teachings about maintaining composure under pressure served her well in this moment, though she had never imagined applying those lessons to high school social dynamics rather than boxing competition. She kept her eyes downcast and her shoulders slightly hunched, maintaining the submissive body language that had become her camouflage at Clearwater Academy. "I'm fine," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of students moving through the hallways. "Thank you for asking." The response was perfectly calibrated to avoid escalation while demonstrating the kind of passive submission that bullies found encouraging. Trevor's smile widened as he recognized the behavioral pattern that indicated a successful target identification. Students who responded to initial provocation with aggressive self-defense typically proved too troublesome to pursue, while those who immediately sought adult intervention presented unacceptable risks of official consequences. Sophia's quiet acceptance of humiliation without complaint or resistance marked her as an ideal victim for their systematic harassment campaigns. "No problem at all," Trevor replied, his tone now openly condescending as he recognized that Sophia posed no immediate threat to his dominance. "Just watch where you're going next time. I wouldn't want you to get hurt or anything. These hallways can be really dangerous for people who don't know how to handle themselves." The threat embedded in his seemingly helpful advice was unmistakable to Sophia, who recognized the classic pattern of establishing dominance through veiled intimidation. Her boxing experience had taught her to read subtext in verbal exchanges, as fighters often used psychological warfare to gain advantages before physical confrontation began. Trevor's warning about danger was actually a promise of future harassment delivered in language that would sound innocent to casual observers, while conveying clear menace to its intended target. Madison stepped closer to Sophia, invading her personal space in a way that would have triggered immediate defensive responses if Sophia had been free to act on her instincts. The calculated invasion of personal boundaries was another classic intimidation tactic designed to establish dominance while testing the target's willingness to defend themselves. Madison's petite stature made the aggression seem less threatening to potential witnesses while actually increasing the psychological pressure on Sophia, who was forced to endure the discomfort without any socially acceptable way to create distance. "You know," Madison said conversationally, "I was just thinking that you might want to be more social. Clearwater can be really isolating for people who don't make an effort to fit in. There are so many opportunities to get involved and make friends, but you have to put yourself out there. Hiding in corners and avoiding people isn't going to help you succeed here." The advice was delivered with the kind of patronizing tone typically reserved for small children or intellectually disabled individuals, designed to infantilize Sophia while positioning Madison as a superior figure offering guidance from a position of authority. The suggestion that Sophia's isolation was self-imposed rather than the result of deliberate exclusion by students like Madison herself was a particularly sophisticated form of gaslighting that shifted blame for social problems onto the victim rather than the perpetrators. Connor nodded in agreement with Madison's assessment, though his contribution to the conversation revealed less psychological sophistication and more straightforward aggression. "Yeah, absolutely. This place has traditions and ways of doing things that go back generations. People who don't respect those traditions usually don't last very long here. It's not personal or anything, just the way things work." The reference to traditions and generational continuity was designed to emphasize Sophia's outsider status while suggesting that her presence at Clearwater Academy was temporary and contingent on the approval of students whose families had deeper connections to the institution. Connor's comment about people not lasting long contained an implicit threat about making her experience so unpleasant that she would choose to transfer rather than continue enduring harassment. The warning bell for third period provided Sophia with an opportunity to escape the increasingly uncomfortable encounter without appearing to flee from confrontation. She clutched her reorganized binder against her chest and mumbled something about needing to get to class, then moved quickly toward the science wing while the three students watched her retreat with expressions of satisfaction. Their first probe had confirmed what they suspected about her: vulnerability and willingness to submit to intimidation without resistance. Trevor, Madison, and Connor exchanged meaningful glances as they separated to attend their respective classes, each understanding that they had identified a promising target for their harassment campaigns. The encounter had provided valuable intelligence about Sophia's personality, social connections, and likely responses to future pressure. Her submissive behavior and obvious discomfort confirmed that she lacked the confidence or support system necessary to resist systematic bullying. The remaining students in the hallway dispersed without comment about the interaction they had witnessed, demonstrating the social dynamics that allowed such behavior to continue unchecked at Clearwater Academy. The culture of non-interference that protected wealthy students from consequences for their actions also abandoned vulnerable targets to whatever harassment their tormentors chose to inflict. Teachers were too busy managing their academic responsibilities to monitor social interactions closely, while students protected themselves by avoiding involvement in conflicts that might draw unwanted attention to their own vulnerabilities. Sophia arrived at her advanced chemistry classroom with her hands still shaking slightly from the suppressed adrenaline that her body had produced in response to the threatening encounter. She took her usual seat in the back corner of the classroom and spent the first few minutes of the lesson trying to process what had just happened while maintaining the appearance of normal academic engagement. Her notebook remained blank as Mr. Patterson began his lecture about molecular bonding, her mind too occupied with tactical assessments and threat analysis to focus on chemical formulas. The realization that she had been deliberately targeted by Trevor's group created a cascade of strategic considerations that her boxing background had taught her to evaluate systematically. She understood that the hallway encounter was likely a testing phase designed to assess her responses to pressure and determine whether she represented a worthwhile target for continued harassment. Her submissive reaction had probably encouraged them to proceed with whatever campaign they were planning, which meant that future encounters would likely be more aggressive and deliberately humiliating. The irony of her situation wasn't lost on her as she sat in the back of the chemistry classroom, surrounded by students who had no idea that the quiet girl they ignored was capable of ending any physical confrontation in a matter of seconds. Her hands, which appeared small and delicate as she gripped her mechanical pencil, had delivered knockout punches to opponents who outweighed her by 50 pounds or more. Her slight frame, which seemed to invite protection rather than inspire fear, concealed muscles that had been conditioned through years of intensive training to generate devastating power. Through perfect technique and timing, the decision to maintain her passive facade despite having the ability to defend herself represented one of the most difficult challenges Sophia had ever faced, requiring her to deny every instinct that had been developed through years of competitive boxing. The discipline that had made her a champion was now being tested in ways that her trainers had never anticipated, as she was forced to choose between protecting her secret identity and protecting herself from harassment that she knew was only beginning. The harassment campaign that Trevor, Madison, and Connor launched against Sophia, following their successful initial probe, evolved with the methodical precision of a military operation, escalating gradually from subtle social exclusion to increasingly brazen acts of intimidation designed to break her spirit while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. Their systematic approach to psychological warfare demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of how to inflict maximum damage while avoiding the kind of obvious evidence that might trigger intervention from faculty members who were already overburdened with academic responsibilities and reluctant to involve themselves in student social dynamics. The first phase of their campaign focused on isolating Sophia from any potential sources of support through carefully orchestrated social manipulation that made her appear odd and antisocial to other students who might otherwise have befriended her. Madison took the lead in this aspect of their operation, using her extensive network of social connections to spread carefully crafted rumors about Sophia's background and behavior that weren't technically false, but created negative impressions. Through selective emphasis and strategic omission of context, she described Sophia's quiet demeanor as weird and antisocial, her academic focus as obsessive and competitive, and her modest clothing choices as evidence that she doesn't understand how things work at Clearwater. The rumors spread through the student body with the viral efficiency that only high school gossip could achieve, helped along by Madison's skill at identifying the most influential nodes in Clearwater's social network and providing them with information that felt like exclusive insider knowledge. She never presented these details as malicious gossip, but rather as concerned observations about a troubled new student who might benefit from understanding how she was being perceived by her peers. This framing allowed Madison to position herself as helpful rather than harmful while ensuring that the information reached maximum distribution throughout the school's various social circles. Trevor's contribution to the isolation campaign involved using his residual influence from his lacrosse days to ensure that Sophia was excluded from group activities and social events, where she might have formed connections with other students. His approach was more direct than Madison's but equally effective, relying on his ability to make subtle suggestions that carried the weight of social authority even after his own status had been diminished by academic problems. A word to the right people was sufficient to ensure that Sophia wasn't invited to study groups, party planning sessions, or casual gatherings where friendships typically formed among Clearwater students. Connor's role in the isolation phase was more psychological than social, involving the creation of an atmosphere of low-level menace that made other students uncomfortable about associating with Sophia, even if they might have been inclined to befriend her. His presence in hallways and common areas where Sophia spent time created an unspoken threat that anyone who showed her kindness might become targets themselves. His wrestling background had taught him how to project intimidation through body language and positioning, skills that proved remarkably transferable to social manipulation when combined with his natural aggression and unpredictable temperament. Success of their isolation efforts became apparent within a week when Sophia's attempts to participate in group discussions during class were met with polite but distant responses that made it clear she wasn't welcome in the established social circles. Students who had initially seemed friendly during her first days at Clearwater now avoided eye contact and found reasons to end conversations quickly when she approached. The few attempts she made to join study groups or collaborate on projects were met with excuses about prior commitments or suggestions that the groups were already full. The transition to direct harassment began during Sophia's 4th week at Clearwater Academy when Trevor decided that the isolation campaign had sufficiently weakened her social position to allow for more aggressive tactics without significant risk of retaliation or intervention. The shift was marked by increasingly frequent, accidental encounters in hallways where books were knocked from her hands, drinks were spilled on her clothing, and personal items mysteriously disappeared from her locker or desk. Each incident was carefully crafted to appear coincidental while creating a pattern of misfortune that reinforced her status as a target. The cafeteria became a particularly effective venue for public humiliation, as the large space and chaotic atmosphere provided multiple opportunities for staged accidents that would embarrass Sophia in front of maximum audiences. Madison perfected a technique of walking past Sophia's table while carrying a full tray and then stumbling in a way that sent food flying across Sophia's clothing and schoolwork. The apologetic aftermath always included loud expressions of concern and offers to help clean up that drew even more attention to Sophia's predicament while allowing Madison to appear sympathetic and helpful to casual observers. Trevor's preferred method of cafeteria harassment involved the strategic placement of obstacles in Sophia's path as she navigated between tables, carrying her own lunch tray. A carefully positioned foot or accidentally dropped backpack would send Sophia stumbling and usually resulted in her lunch ending up on the floor or splattered across nearby surfaces. The mess created additional humiliation as Sophia was forced to clean up while other students watched and sometimes laughed at her clumsiness. Trevor's expressions of concern and offers to buy her a replacement lunch always came with subtle reminders about her need to be more careful and aware of her surroundings. Connor's contribution to the cafeteria campaign was more directly intimidating, involving deliberate invasions of Sophia's personal space and veiled threats delivered in tones that wouldn't attract attention from supervising faculty members. He would sit uninvited at her table and make comments about her appearance, her food choices, and her apparent friendlessness while positioning himself close enough to make her physically uncomfortable. His wrestling background allowed him to use subtle physical pressure through crowding and positioning that created claustrophobic situations without involving obvious aggressive contact. The escalation continued into academic settings where the trio found creative ways to sabotage Sophia's classroom performance without creating evidence that could be traced back to their deliberate interference. Madison developed a talent for asking questions during group discussions that put Sophia in awkward positions, either by highlighting her outsider status or by creating situations where any response would sound offensive or inappropriate. Trevor's approach involved making comments that undermined Sophia's academic contributions by suggesting that her ideas were obvious, irrelevant, or copied from other sources. Connor's academic harassment was less subtle, but equally effective, involving deliberate disruption of Sophia's concentration through strategic noisemaking, movement, and positioning that made it difficult for her to focus during lectures or exams. His technique of drumming fingers, tapping feet, and shifting positions created constant low-level distraction that accumulated over time to significantly impact her academic performance. The behavior was never quite obvious enough to warrant teacher intervention, but was persistent enough to create genuine stress and fatigue. The psychological toll of the constant harassment began to manifest in ways that Sophia struggled to hide from her mother during their brief evening conversations about school. Her grades remained excellent through sheer determination and natural ability, but the effort required to maintain academic performance while enduring systematic bullying was exhausting in ways that her boxing training had never prepared her for. Physical challenges had clear parameters and definite endpoints, while social persecution was amorphous and seemingly endless. Sleep became increasingly elusive as Sophia's mind raced through tactical assessments and strategic considerations that kept her awake long past her normal bedtime. Her boxing training had conditioned her to analyze opponents and develop counter strategies, but the social dynamics at Clearwater Academy didn't follow the clear rules and boundaries that governed athletic competition. The weapons being used against her were psychological rather than physical, and her ability to defend herself through superior fighting skills was irrelevant to the type of warfare being conducted. The physical symptoms of stress began to accumulate. Despite her efforts to maintain the disciplined conditioning that had sustained her through years of competitive boxing, headaches became frequent companions, caused partly by the constant tension of maintaining her submissive facade and partly by the cognitive dissonance of pretending to be helpless while possessing devastating fighting abilities. Her appetite decreased as mealtimes became anxiety-inducing ordeals where harassment was most likely to occur in public settings. The deterioration of her emotional state was perhaps the most troubling aspect of her experience, as Sophia had never before encountered challenges that couldn't be overcome through discipline, training, and superior preparation. Boxing had taught her that hard work and technical excellence would eventually triumph over any obstacle, but the social dynamics at Clearwater Academy seemed designed to punish merit and reward cruelty. The realization that her academic achievements and personal character meant nothing in the face of systematic bullying was profoundly demoralizing. Her daily routine became an exhausting exercise in hypervigilance as she constantly scanned for threats and planned escape routes through hallways that had become battlefields. The confidence that had characterized her movement in boxing gyms was replaced by nervous tension that made every journey between classes feel like running a gauntlet. Her natural athlete's posture gave way to the hunched shoulders and downcast eyes that had become her protective camouflage, though the physical toll of constantly fighting against her natural bearing was creating chronic pain in her neck and back. The isolation from her former identity as a champion boxer was perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of her ordeal. The discipline and mental toughness that had made her successful in competition now seemed like cruel jokes, as she was forced to endure humiliation that could have ended instantly if she had been free to use her abilities. The knowledge that she possessed the skills to neutralize her tormentors in seconds made their continued harassment feel like a form of elaborate psychological torture. The breaking point was approaching with mathematical inevitability as Trevor, Madison, and Connor grew bolder in their attacks and began planning the kind of direct confrontation that would force Sophia to choose between maintaining her secret and protecting herself from assault. Their success in isolating her from potential allies and establishing their dominance through systematic harassment had convinced them that she was completely helpless and could be pushed as far as they chose without meaningful resistance. They had no way of knowing that their next escalation would trigger responses that would fundamentally alter the power dynamics at Clearwater Academy and teach them the difference between restraint and weakness, the accumulating weight of constant harassment and social isolation began to manifest in ways that Sophia could no longer completely hide from her mother. Despite her determined efforts to maintain the facade that everything was proceeding normally at Clearwater Academy, Dr. Lisa Chen's trained medical eye noticed subtle changes in her daughter's behavior and physical condition that might have escaped a less observant parent. Though Sophia's explanations about adjustment stress and academic pressure provided plausible cover for symptoms that could have indicated more serious problems, the irony wasn't lost on Sophia that her mother spent her days treating children who had suffered various forms of trauma, while remaining unaware that her own daughter was enduring systematic psychological warfare. The first sign that Dr. Chen detected was a change in Sophia's sleep patterns, evidenced by dark circles under her eyes and a general fatigue that seemed disproportionate to her academic workload. When questioned about her exhaustion, Sophia attributed it to the challenge of adapting to Clearwater's more rigorous curriculum and the pressure of maintaining the perfect grades that her parents expected. This explanation was technically accurate, as the stress of enduring daily harassment while maintaining academic excellence was indeed exhausting, but it concealed the true source of her difficulties behind a socially acceptable cover story. The deterioration of Sophia's appetite became apparent during family dinners when she picked at her food and claimed to have eaten large lunches at school that made her less hungry in the evenings. Chen's medical training had taught her to recognize eating disorders and nutritional deficiencies, but Sophia's explanations about cafeteria food and changing meal schedules seemed reasonable for a teenager adjusting to a new school environment. The truth was that mealtimes at Clearwater had become so anxiety-inducing that Sophia often skipped lunch entirely to avoid the harassment that regularly occurred in the cafeteria. Perhaps most concerning to Dr. Chen was a subtle change in Sophia's posture and movement patterns that seemed inconsistent with her years of athletic training. The confident bearing and fluid motion that had characterized Sophia's physical presence since childhood had been replaced by hunched shoulders and cautious movements that suggested either injury or psychological distress. When Dr. Chen inquired about possible sports-related problems, Sophia deflected by discussing her frustration with not having found a suitable boxing gym yet, which was partially true but concealed the real reasons for her altered body language. The academic pressure that Sophia faced was genuine and intensifying, though not for the reasons her mother assumed. Maintaining perfect grades while enduring constant psychological harassment required enormous mental discipline and energy reserves that were being depleted faster than they could be replenished. The concentration required for advanced chemistry equations became nearly impossible when Connor was deliberately creating distractions 3 seats away. Literature discussions became exercises in social navigation when Madison used every opportunity to highlight Sophia's outsider status through carefully worded questions and comments. Her advanced placement classes, which should have been sources of intellectual stimulation and academic achievement, became additional battlegrounds where her tormentors found new ways to undermine her confidence and performance. Group projects became opportunities for social exclusion when other students followed Trevor's subtle suggestions about team composition. Oral presentations became exercises in public humiliation when Madison asked pointed questions designed to make Sophia appear defensive or unprepared. Even individual assignments suffered when the stress of anticipating harassment made it difficult to focus during study periods. The psychological warfare being conducted against Sophia had evolved beyond simple intimidation into a sophisticated campaign designed to attack her sense of identity and self-worth. Trevor had identified her academic excellence as a source of personal pride, and systematically worked to undermine her achievements through strategic questioning of her capabilities and suggestions that her success was due to luck or favorable treatment rather than merit. His comments about grade inflation at her previous school and the different standards expected at Clearwater were designed to create doubt about her intellectual abilities. Madison's approach was more insidious, focusing on Sophia's social isolation and suggesting that her academic focus was compensation for her inability to form normal relationships with peers. Her observations about Sophia's appearance, social skills, and family background were delivered with the kind of false concern that made them particularly difficult to dismiss or counter. The suggestion that Sophia was obsessed with grades because she lacked other sources of validation was psychologically devastating because it contained just enough truth to create genuine self-doubt. Connor's contribution was more direct but equally effective, involving constant reminders about Sophia's physical vulnerability and outsider status that reinforced her sense of helplessness. His comments about her size, strength, and ability to defend herself were particularly cruel given her hidden capabilities, but she was forced to accept them without response to maintain her cover. The psychological torture of being called weak and helpless by someone she could have defeated effortlessly was almost unbearable. The internal conflict that Sophia experienced between her natural instincts and her forced passivity was creating psychological stress that manifested in physical symptoms her boxing training had never prepared her to handle. The discipline that had made her a champion required channeling aggression and competitive drive into productive action, but her current situation demanded the suppression of these same qualities that had defined her identity for most of her conscious life. The cognitive dissonance of pretending to be someone completely opposite to her true nature was taking a toll that accumulated daily. Her grandfather's teachings about mental discipline and emotional control had emphasized the importance of maintaining inner calm while facing external pressure, but those lessons had been developed for boxing competition, where physical action provided an outlet for psychological tension. The requirement to remain passive while enduring systematic harassment violated every principle of self-defense that Wei Ming had taught her, creating internal contradictions that were becoming increasingly difficult to manage without some form of release or resolution. The isolation from her boxing identity was perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of her ordeal, as it required her to deny the achievements and abilities that had provided structure and meaning to her life. For nearly a decade, the champion who had stood in ring centers accepting trophies now had to pretend that physical confrontation was terrifying, and that she lacked the confidence to defend herself against high school bullies. The disconnect between her true capabilities and her performed helplessness was creating an identity crisis that threatened her psychological stability. Sleep had become increasingly elusive as Sophia's mind raced through tactical assessments and strategic planning that her training had conditioned her to perform automatically when facing opposition. Her boxing background had taught her to analyze opponents' strengths and weaknesses, develop counter-strategies, and maintain mental preparation for competition. But these same analytical processes now tortured her with detailed knowledge of exactly how she could neutralize her tormentors if she were free to act. The knowledge that she possessed multiple solutions to her problems while being unable to implement any of them was a special form of psychological torment. The hypervigilance required to navigate Clearwater's hallways safely was exhausting in ways that physical training had never been, as it required constant attention to social dynamics, escape routes, and threat assessment without the clear rules and boundaries that governed athletic competition. Every transition between classes became a tactical operation where positioning, timing, and situational awareness were crucial for avoiding harassment. The mental energy required for this constant defensive preparation was depleting her reserves faster than they could be replenished through rest and recovery. Her academic performance, while still excellent by external measures, was beginning to suffer in subtle ways that only Sophia could detect. The precision and focus that had characterized her work since elementary school were being compromised by the stress and distraction of her situation. Complex chemistry problems that should have been routine required multiple attempts to solve correctly. Literature essays lacked the analytical depth that had always distinguished her writing. Mathematical proofs that would normally flow logically seemed to require enormous effort to construct properly. Realization that her harassment was affecting other students who were too frightened to offer support created additional psychological pressure that complicated her already difficult situation. She could see the mixture of pity and relief in other students' eyes when they witnessed her humiliation, understanding that their safety depended on remaining uninvolved in conflicts that might attract attention to their own vulnerabilities. The knowledge that her suffering was protecting others from similar harassment created moral complications that made her situation even more psychologically complex. The approaching winter break offered the promise of temporary respite from daily harassment, but Sophia understood that returning to school after the holiday would likely bring escalated pressure as Trevor's group sought to re-establish their dominance and continue their campaign. The anticipation of renewed harassment after a brief period of safety was almost as stressful as the harassment itself, as it prevented her from fully enjoying even temporary relief from the constant psychological pressure. The breaking point was approaching with inevitable momentum as the accumulated stress of maintaining her deception while enduring systematic harassment reached levels that threatened her ability to continue functioning normally. The discipline that had sustained her through years of competitive boxing was being tested in ways that physical training had never anticipated, and she was beginning to understand that some situations couldn't be resolved through patience and endurance alone. The carefully constructed walls between her public persona and private identity were developing cracks that wouldn't survive much additional pressure. The incident that would ultimately shatter Sophia's carefully maintained facade began on a Friday afternoon in late November, when the dreary Pacific Northwest weather had driven most students indoors during what would normally have been outdoor lunch periods. The auxiliary gymnasium, typically used for wrestling practice and equipment storage, had become an unofficial gathering place for students seeking shelter from the persistent drizzle that had been falling since early morning. The building's isolated location and minimal supervision made it an ideal venue for the kind of confrontation that Trevor, Madison, and Connor had been planning as the culmination of their systematic harassment campaign. Sophia had sought refuge in the auxiliary gym's upper level, where old wrestling mats were stored alongside outdated exercise equipment that the school had retired but hadn't yet discarded. She had discovered this location during her second week at Clearwater and found it provided the perfect combination of solitude and accessibility that allowed her to eat lunch in peace while remaining technically within the bounds of acceptable student behavior. The space reminded her of the older sections of her grandfather's gym in Chicago, with its institutional lighting and the lingering scent of athletic exertion that brought back memories of a time when her identity hadn't been a carefully guarded secret. The storage area had become her sanctuary during the most difficult periods of harassment, offering a place where she could lower her guard temporarily and reconnect with the physical confidence that had defined her for most of her life. She would sometimes shadowbox quietly among the stored equipment, running through combinations that kept her skills sharp while providing emotional release from the psychological pressure of maintaining her submissive persona. These brief sessions were risky because discovery would raise questions about her background, but they were necessary to maintain her sanity and connection to her true identity. On this particular Friday, Sophia had been reviewing chemistry notes while eating a sandwich from home when she heard voices echoing from the main gymnasium floor below. The acoustic properties of the building carried sound clearly between levels, and she immediately recognized Trevor's distinctive laugh, followed by Madison's higher-pitched voice and Connor's gruff responses. The tone of their conversation suggested excitement and anticipation that made Sophia's instincts scream warnings about impending danger. Her boxing training had taught her to recognize the subtle changes in atmosphere that preceded violent confrontation, and every indication suggested that she had inadvertently walked into a trap. The realization that they had been tracking her movements and had chosen this isolated location for their confrontation sent adrenaline surging through Sophia's system as her body automatically prepared for the kind of physical conflict she had been avoiding for months. Her heart rate increased, her breathing deepened, and her muscles tensed in the distinctive pattern that preceded explosive action. The transformation was so automatic that she had to consciously force herself to relax and maintain the passive demeanor that had protected her secret for so long. The sound of footsteps on the metal stairs leading to the storage area confirmed her worst fears about their intentions, while simultaneously triggering tactical assessments that her training had burned into her subconscious mind. The stairway was narrow and would funnel any attackers into a confined space where superior technique could overcome numerical disadvantages. The storage area itself offered multiple improvised weapons in the form of exercise equipment and wrestling mats that could be used defensively or offensively depending on circumstances. Most importantly, there were no witnesses or cameras in this section of the building, which meant that whatever happened would come down to conflicting accounts that favored students with established credibility and family connections. Trevor appeared first at the top of the stairs, his confident smile indicating that he believed he had successfully cornered his prey in a location where she couldn't escape or call for help. His body language projected the kind of predatory satisfaction that Sophia had seen in opponents who believed they had gained decisive advantages during boxing matches. The comparison wasn't lost on her, as she recognized that this confrontation would follow many of the same psychological patterns as competitive fighting, though the rules of engagement would be completely different. Madison followed close behind Trevor, her expression combining anticipation with calculated cruelty that suggested she had been looking forward to this moment for weeks. Her positioning slightly to Trevor's left created the beginning of the tactical formation that Sophia recognized from their previous encounters, designed to limit escape routes while maximizing their psychological impact. The careful coordination of their movements indicated significant planning and preparation for this confrontation. Connor completed their formation by positioning himself near the stairway exit, effectively cutting off Sophia's most obvious escape route while maintaining the triangular positioning that had become their signature intimidation tactic. His wrestling background was evident in the way he controlled space and angles, though he was applying these skills against someone whose tactical awareness far exceeded his own. The irony of using amateur wrestling techniques against a nationally ranked boxing champion would have been amusing under different circumstances. Well, Trevor said, his voice carrying the kind of theatrical menace that suggested he had been rehearsing this moment in his mind. Look what we found hiding up here all by herself. Our favorite little ghost girl, trying to disappear again. But you can't hide from us forever, can you, Sophia? We've been looking for you. The use of her name created a more personal and threatening atmosphere than their previous encounters, which had maintained a thin veneer of accidental harassment that could be explained away if questioned by authorities. This deliberate escalation indicated that they had moved beyond testing phases into direct confrontation, where plausible deniability was no longer a concern. The shift in tone and approach suggested that they intended this encounter to be definitive. In establishing their dominance over her, Madison stepped closer to Sophia, her petite frame moving with the kind of predatory grace that reminded Sophia uncomfortably of opponents who specialized in psychological warfare before physical confrontation. We've been talking about you, sweetie. About how you think you're better than everyone else with your perfect grades and your antisocial attitude. It's really quite sad, actually. Here you are at one of the most prestigious schools in the country, and you can't even make a single friend. The psychological attack was more sophisticated than Sophia had expected, targeting her insecurities about social isolation, while simultaneously suggesting that her academic success was somehow offensive to other students. The implication that her achievements were the cause of her problems, rather than the harassment she had endured, was a particularly cruel form of victim blaming that required enormous self-control to endure without response. Connor moved closer from his position near the stairs, his larger frame creating additional physical pressure, while his voice carried unmistakable threats about what might happen if Sophia continued to resist their dominance. The thing is, new girl, the school has certain traditions and expectations that people like you don't seem to understand. Maybe where you came from, being weird and unfriendly was acceptable, but that's not how things work here. We think it's time you learn some important lessons about respect and knowing your place. The reference to people like you was deliberately ambiguous but clearly derogatory, designed to emphasize Sophia's outsider status while suggesting that she represented some category of person who didn't belong at Clearwater Academy. The threat about learning lessons was accompanied by physical positioning that made it clear the education they had in mind would involve humiliation and possibly violence. Trevor stepped even closer to Sophia, invading her personal space in a way that would have triggered immediate defensive responses from anyone with combat training who wasn't constrained by the need to maintain their cover. His proximity was calculated to create claustrophobic pressure while demonstrating his belief that she was too weak and frightened to resist whatever they had planned. The psychological dynamics of the confrontation were following predictable patterns that Sophia recognized from competitive environments, though the stakes were completely different. You know what I think? Trevor continued, his voice dropping to a more intimate and threatening tone. I think you need to understand exactly where you stand in the social hierarchy here. And I think the best way to teach you that lesson is to show everyone at school exactly what kind of person you really are underneath all that fake modesty and academic achievement. The threat implicit in his words about showing everyone what kind of person you really are carried ominous implications about public humiliation that would be designed to destroy her reputation and social standing permanently. Sophia's tactical mind was already calculating response options, while her conscious mind struggled with the realization that her months of careful avoidance had only delayed an inevitable confrontation that would force her to choose between maintaining her secret and protecting herself from assault. The moment of truth was approaching with inexorable momentum as Trevor reached toward the hem of her oversized sweater with obvious intentions of forcing the kind of humiliation that would cross every line she had drawn about acceptable harassment. The careful control she had maintained for months was about to be tested in ways that would determine not only her immediate safety, but the entire future course of her experience at Clearwater Academy, the transformation that overtook Sophia Chen. In the seconds following Trevor's grab for her clothing was so complete and instantaneous that her three tormentors barely had time to process what was happening before finding themselves on the receiving end of violence they could never have imagined from the quiet girl they had been systematically tormenting for months. The moment Trevor's fingers made contact with the fabric of her sweater, every carefully constructed barrier between Sophia's public persona and her true identity shattered like glass, releasing years of pent-up frustration and the devastating fighting skills that had made her a three-time national champion. The first indication that something had gone catastrophically wrong with their planned humiliation came when Trevor's confident grab for Sophia's clothing was met not with the terrified submission they expected, but with a lightning-fast defensive movement that trapped his wrist in a grip that felt like a steel vise. Sophia's reaction was so automatic that it bypassed conscious thought entirely, her body responding with the kind of instantaneous precision that only comes from thousands of hours of repetitive training under high-pressure conditions. Her left hand shot up to control Trevor's arm while her right hand positioned itself for a devastating counterattack that would end the confrontation before he could comprehend the magnitude of his mistake. Trevor's face registered shock and confusion as he found himself unable to pull his hand free from Sophia's grip. His superior size and strength completely neutralized by technique and leverage that he didn't understand. The confident smirk that had characterized his expression throughout their harassment campaign disappeared instantly, replaced by the kind of wide-eyed panic that comes with the sudden realization that a situation has spiraled completely beyond one's control. His attempts to jerk his arm free only tightened Sophia's grip and positioned him perfectly for the devastating combination that her boxing instincts had already selected based on his height, stance, and positioning. Madison's reaction to the sudden shift in dynamics was a high-pitched gasp that echoed off the walls of the storage area as she witnessed the complete reversal of power that she had never imagined possible. Her carefully cultivated image of Sophia as a weak and helpless victim evaporated in the space of a heartbeat, replaced by the terrifying realization that they had been systematically harassing someone who possessed capabilities that made their previous intimidation tactics seem like children's games. The petite girl who had seemed so vulnerable and easy to victimize had transformed into something that radiated danger in ways that made Madison's survival instincts scream warnings about immediate threats to her safety. Connor's wrestling background allowed him to recognize the technical precision of Sophia's defensive movement, even if he couldn't fully comprehend its implications. And his attempt to intervene by grabbing her from behind was met with a response that demonstrated the vast difference between amateur high school athletics and elite-level combat sports. Sophia's awareness of his approach was total and instantaneous. Her peripheral vision and spatial awareness, honed by years of facing multiple sparring partners in chaotic training environments where threats could come from any direction without warning. The sequence of movements that followed unfolded with the kind of brutal efficiency that would have impressed professional fighters and left amateur observers struggling to understand what they had witnessed. Sophia's response to Connor's attempted bear hug involved a perfectly timed backward elbow strike that caught him in the solar plexus with enough force to empty his lungs completely while simultaneously disrupting his balance and coordination. The impact was precisely calculated to incapacitate without causing permanent damage. Though Connor's inexperience with receiving such techniques made the effect seem far more devastating than Sophia had intended, Connor's collapse to his knees was accompanied by desperate gasping sounds as his diaphragm spasmed and refused to function normally, his wrestling training having provided no preparation for the kind of precise anatomical targeting that Sophia had mastered through years of studying human physiology and pressure point manipulation. His face turned an alarming shade of red as he struggled to draw breath, his hands clutching his chest while his eyes widened with the kind of panic that comes with the sudden inability to perform the basic function of breathing. Trevor's attempts to capitalize on what he perceived as Sophia's momentary distraction with Connor proved to be an even more catastrophic mistake than his initial grab for her clothing. His renewed effort to assert physical dominance through brute force was met with a textbook perfect hip throw that utilized his own momentum and superior size against him in a demonstration of leverage and technique that would have earned approval from her grandfather's most demanding instructors. The throw was executed with such precision that Trevor found himself airborne before his brain could process the mechanics of what was happening to him. The impact of Trevor's body against the stored wrestling mats created a sound like thunder that echoed throughout the auxiliary gymnasium, his 190-pound frame hitting the stacked equipment with enough force to scatter mats across the floor and dent the metal storage rack that had been supporting them. The visual of his much larger body being thrown effortlessly through the air by someone barely 2/3 his size created a cognitive dissonance that Madison struggled to process, her understanding of physical reality having been fundamentally challenged by what she was witnessing. Trevor's landing was followed by several seconds of stunned Silence as he lay among the scattered mats, his breath knocked out and his vision blurred by the impact that had rattled his brain against the inside of his skull. The confident aggression that had characterized his approach to this confrontation had been replaced by genuine fear as he began to understand that he had made a tactical error of monumental proportions. The realization that the quiet girl he had been tormenting possessed fighting skills that made him completely helpless was more psychologically devastating than the physical trauma of being thrown across the room. Madison's attempt to flee the deteriorating situation was cut short by Sophia's instantaneous recognition of the tactical threat posed by a witness, who might summon additional opponents or adult intervention before the confrontation could be resolved definitively. Sophia's pursuit was not aggressive, but rather methodical, her movement demonstrating the kind of controlled intensity that separated professional fighters from amateur brawlers. Her approach to Madison was calculated to intimidate without causing physical harm, relying on presence and demonstrated capability rather than actual violence. The psychological impact of Sophia's transformation on Madison was perhaps more devastating than the physical effects experienced by Trevor and Connor, as it forced her to confront the complete failure of her ability to assess and manipulate other people. Madison's entire identity was built around her skill at reading social dynamics and exploiting psychological weaknesses, but her complete misunderstanding of Sophia's true nature represented a fundamental failure that called into question everything she thought she knew about power and influence. The realization that she had been systematically underestimating someone who could have ended their harassment campaign at any point was profoundly unsettling. Connor's gradual recovery of his breathing was accompanied by a growing awareness of the pain radiating from his solar plexus and the complete helplessness of his position relative to someone whose fighting skills had been revealed as far superior to anything he had encountered in high school wrestling. His competitive experience had taught him to recognize when he was outmatched by superior technique and conditioning, but the magnitude of this skill gap between himself and Sophia was unlike anything he had previously experienced. The knowledge that she had been holding back this level of capability while enduring their harassment created a mixture of fear and grudging respect that fundamentally altered his perception of the situation. Trevor's attempts to regain his footing were hampered by the lingering effects of his impact with the wrestling mats and the complete disorientation that came with having his understanding of physical reality completely overturned in the space of seconds. His previous confidence in his ability to intimidate and dominate others had been built on a foundation of size and aggression that had never been tested against anyone with real fighting skills, and the revelation of his own vulnerability was more shocking than the physical trauma he had sustained. The silence that fell over the storage area in the aftermath of Sophia's defensive demonstration was heavy with the weight of completely altered power dynamics and the recognition by all parties that the careful balance of their previous interactions had been permanently destroyed. The months of systematic harassment had culminated in a confrontation that revealed the true nature of the participants in ways that could never be undone or forgotten. Sophia stood in the center of the scattered wrestling mats, her breathing controlled and her stance relaxed but ready, every aspect of her posture and movement now reflecting the confidence and capability that she had been forced to hide for so long. The transformation was so complete that she seemed like a different person entirely, as if the months of playing a submissive victim had been an elaborate performance that had finally ended with the revelation of her true nature. The three students who had orchestrated this confrontation as the culmination of their harassment campaign found themselves in the unprecedented position of being completely at the mercy of someone they had systematically underestimated and abused. The tables had turned with such devastating completeness that they were struggling to comprehend the magnitude of their miscalculation and the implications for their future interactions with the quiet girl who had just demonstrated capabilities that made their previous intimidation tactics seem like childish pranks. The aftermath of Sophia's explosive demonstration of her true capabilities created a silence so profound that the only sounds in the auxiliary gymnasium storage area were Connor's labored breathing as he struggled to recover from the precise strike to his solar plexus and the distant hum of the building's heating system. The three students who had orchestrated this confrontation as the culmination of their systematic harassment campaign now found themselves sprawled across scattered wrestling mats, their positions a stark visual representation of how completely their understanding of power dynamics had been overturned in the span of mere seconds. Trevor remained flat on his back among the displaced equipment, his vision still swimming from the impact that had rattled his brain and left him struggling to process the magnitude of his miscalculation. The confident aggression that had defined his approach to this encounter had evaporated entirely, replaced by a mixture of physical pain and psychological shock that made it difficult for him to form coherent thoughts. His attempts to push himself into a sitting position were hampered by dizziness and the lingering disorientation that came with having his entire worldview shattered by someone he had fundamentally misjudged. Madison had pressed herself against the wall near the stairway, her petite frame trembling with the kind of primal fear that bypassed rational thought and triggered pure survival instincts. Her carefully cultivated image as a master manipulator had crumbled in the face of Sophia's transformation, revealing the frightened teenager beneath the sophisticated facade she had maintained throughout their harassment campaign. The realization that she had been systematically tormenting someone who possessed the physical capability to end any confrontation instantly was creating psychological aftershocks that would reshape her understanding of risk and consequence for years to come. Connor had managed to regain partial control of his breathing, though each inhalation still sent sharp pains through his chest where Sophia's elbow had found its target with surgical precision. His wrestling experience had taught him to recognize when he was completely outmatched, but the technical superiority demonstrated by Sophia was unlike anything he had encountered in competitive athletics. The knowledge that she had delivered the strike with enough control to incapacitate without causing permanent damage was almost more unsettling than if she had simply attacked with uncontrolled violence. Sophia herself stood in the center of the chaos she had created with a composure that reflected years of post-fight discipline instilled by her grandfather's teachings about maintaining emotional control even in victory. Her breathing had already returned to normal patterns. Her stance remained balanced and ready for additional threats, and her expression showed none of the emotional volatility that might have been expected after such an intense physical confrontation. The transformation from terrified victim to confident fighter was so complete that she seemed like an entirely different person than Pruford, the one who had been cowering minutes earlier. The silence stretched until Trevor finally found his voice, though what emerged was barely a whisper that reflected his complete psychological capitulation rather than any attempt to reassert dominance. What are you?" he managed to ask, his tone carrying none of the arrogance that had characterized his previous interactions with Sophia. The question revealed his struggle to reconcile the helpless victim he thought he had been tormenting with the skilled fighter who had just demonstrated capabilities that made his own physical advantages meaningless. Sophia's response was delivered in a voice that carried the kind of quiet authority that comes from genuine confidence rather than manufactured bravado, her tone completely different from the submissive whispers that had characterized her previous communications with her tormentors. "I'm someone who's been trying very hard not to hurt any of you," she said, the implicit threat in her words made more powerful by the obvious restraint she had shown even while defending herself. "I'm someone who could have ended this harassment campaign on the first day, but chose not to because I was trying to avoid exactly this kind of situation." The revelation that Sophia had been deliberately allowing their harassment to continue rather than being helpless to stop it created a new layer of psychological trauma for her three tormentors, as it forced them to confront the reality that Their months of systematic cruelty had been conducted at her sufferance rather than through their own dominance. Madison's sharp intake of breath indicated her understanding of the implications, while Connor's expression showed the dawning recognition that every humiliation they had inflicted could have been prevented or reversed at any moment. Trevor's attempt to process this information was visible in his changing facial expressions as he worked through the ramifications of having spent months antagonizing someone who possessed the capability to seriously injure him with minimal effort. The realization that Sophia's apparent vulnerability had been a carefully maintained facade created questions about her background and training that made him understand how completely he had misjudged the situation from the very beginning. His voice carried a note of desperate curiosity when he asked, "Who taught you to fight like that?" The question opened a door that Sophia had kept carefully closed for months, and her decision to answer represented a fundamental shift in her approach to maintaining her secret identity at Clearwater Academy. "My grandfather trained fighters in Hong Kong before immigrating to Chicago, where he established one of the most respected boxing gyms in the Midwest," she said, her voice carrying pride that had been suppressed for too long. "My father was an Olympic-level boxer before a shoulder injury ended his competitive career. I've been training since I was 9 years old, and I've won 3 national championships in my weight class." The casual revelation of credentials that placed Sophia among the elite ranks of amateur boxing created a stunned silence as her tormentors began to understand the true magnitude of their error in targeting her for harassment. Connor's wrestling background gave him enough knowledge of combat sports to recognize that 3 national championships represented a level of achievement that indicated world-class talent and dedication. The realization that they had been systematically bullying someone whose fighting resume would have impressed professional athletes was almost beyond comprehension. Madison found her voice first, though what emerged was a barely audible whisper that reflected her complete psychological capitulation. "Why didn't you tell anyone? Why did you let us ... She trailed off, unable to complete the question as she struggled to understand motivations that seemed completely irrational given Sophia's obvious capability to defend herself from the beginning. Sophia's explanation revealed the complex family dynamics and strategic considerations that had kept her true identity hidden despite months of escalating harassment. "My parents insisted that I keep my boxing background secret to avoid complications at a new school," she said, her tone carrying the frustration of someone who had been forced to deny a fundamental part of their identity. "They were concerned that my reputation as a fighter would overshadow my academic achievements and create unnecessary drama in what they saw as a sophisticated educational environment." The irony that Sophia's parents' attempt to protect her from social complications had actually exposed her to systematic harassment was not lost on any of the participants in this confrontation. Trevor's bitter laugh carried recognition of the perverse logic that had created this situation, while Connor's expression showed understanding that their campaign of intimidation had succeeded only because their target had been artificially constrained from defending herself. Trevor's next words carried a tone of genuine remorse that his previous interactions with Sophia had never suggested he possessed. "We had no idea," he said, though even as he spoke the words he seemed to recognize their inadequacy as an explanation for months of deliberate cruelty. "I mean, that doesn't excuse what we did, but we never would have ... He trailed off as he realized that claiming they wouldn't have harassed her if they had known about her fighting ability was essentially admitting that they targeted her specifically because they believed she was helpless. Madison's contribution to this moment of reckoning was more direct and revealed a level of self-awareness that had been absent during their harassment campaigns. "We chose you because we thought you were weak," she said, her voice carrying the shame of someone confronting the ugly reality of their own motivations. "We targeted you specifically because you seemed like someone who couldn't fight back. That makes what we did even worse, doesn't it?" Connor's wrestling experience had taught him about the code of honor that was supposed to govern physical competition, and his understanding of how completely they had violated those principles was evident in his expression of genuine shame. "In wrestling, you compete against people at your own skill level," he said quietly. "What we were doing was like varsity athletes picking fights with middle school kids. Except it turns out we were middle school kids, and we just didn't know it." The recognition that their harassment campaign had been built on completely false assumptions about relative power and capability created a moment of moral reckoning that forced all three tormentors to confront the ethical implications of their behavior in ways they had previously avoided. The revelation that Sophia could have ended their campaign at any point, but had chosen restraint over retaliation, made their months of cruelty seem even more inexcusable. Sophia's response to their expressions of remorse was measured and reflected. The discipline that had been instilled by years of training under instructors who emphasized character development alongside technical skill. "The fact that you thought I was helpless doesn't make your behavior worse," she said. "It reveals what you were already willing to do to people you perceived as vulnerable. My ability to defend myself doesn't change the fact that you spent months trying to destroy someone's sense of safety and belonging." The truth of this observation created an uncomfortable silence as Trevor, Madison, and Connor were forced to confront the reality that their behavior had been fundamentally wrong regardless of their target's hidden capabilities. The knowledge that they had been unconsciously selecting victims based on perceived vulnerability made their actions seem more calculated and cruel than they had been willing to admit even to themselves. The transformation of power dynamics in the storage area was now complete, with Sophia standing in a position of unquestioned authority, while her former tormentors struggled to process the complete reversal of their previous relationship. The months of systematic harassment had culminated in a confrontation that revealed the true character of all participants in ways that would permanently alter their interactions and understanding of themselves. The days following the confrontation in the auxiliary gymnasium brought a transformation to Clearwater Academy's social dynamics that was both immediate and profound, as word of Sophia's defensive demonstration spread through the student body with the viral intensity that only genuinely shocking revelations could achieve. The story evolved and expanded with each retelling, creating a mythology around the quiet transfer student that elevated her from invisible outsider to legendary figure in the span of a single weekend. By Monday morning, even students who had never spoken to Sophia knew that the girl they had dismissed as weak and antisocial had revealed herself to be a nationally ranked boxer capable of defeating multiple opponents. Simultaneously, Trevor Blackwood's return to school after the weekend carried none of the swagger and confidence that had previously characterized his presence in Clearwater's hallways, his movements now cautious and his eyes frequently darting toward potential escape routes as if he expected additional confrontations at any moment. The visible bruising on his arms and torso from his impact with the wrestling equipment served as physical evidence of his encounter with Sophia, though he deflected questions about his injuries with vague references to a recreational accident that fooled no one who had heard even the basic version of events. His former position as an unofficial leader among the school's more aggressive students had evaporated overnight, replaced by a reputation for catastrophically misjudging an opponent in ways that made his previous intimidation tactics seem foolish. Rather than fearsome, Madison Pierce's psychological recovery from the confrontation proved more challenging than the physical injuries sustained by her male accomplices, as the complete failure of her ability to read and manipulate others had shaken her confidence in ways that affected every aspect of her social interactions. The sophisticated facade that had masked her cruel nature now seemed fragile and artificial, as if the revelation of her fundamental misjudgment had exposed flaws in her character that could no longer be hidden behind manufactured charm and strategic positioning. Her attempts to maintain her previous social status were hampered by the knowledge that her reputation for psychological insight had been destroyed by her complete failure to recognize Sophia's true capabilities. Connor Walsh's wrestling background had at least provided him with a framework for understanding how thoroughly he had been outmatched by superior technique and training, though this knowledge brought its own form of humiliation, as he was forced to acknowledge that his competitive experience meant nothing against someone with Sophia's level of skill and preparation. His teammates on the wrestling squad treated him with a mixture of curiosity and embarrassment, recognizing that his involvement in the failed harassment campaign reflected poorly on their sport's supposed emphasis on honor and fair competition. The disconnect between wrestling's stated values and Connor's participation in systematic bullying created tensions within the team that would take months to resolve. Sophia's own experience of the aftermath was complex and emotionally challenging, in ways that her boxing training had not prepared her to handle, as the revelation of her true identity brought both relief and new complications that required constant navigation. The freedom to move through Clearwater's hallways without fear of harassment was accompanied by an awareness that every interaction was now filtered through other students' knowledge of her fighting capabilities. Conversations that should have been casual social exchanges carried undercurrents of wariness and fascination that made genuine connection difficult to achieve. The academic environment at Clearwater Academy had been transformed by Sophia's revelation in ways that extended far beyond her immediate tormentors, as teachers and administrators struggled to process the implications of having a nationally ranked athlete in their midst whose capabilities had remained hidden for months. Mr. Patterson in advanced chemistry began including references to the biomechanics of athletic performance in his lectures. Clearly influenced by his new understanding of Sophia's background, Mrs. Rodriguez, in a P. Literature assigned essays about hidden identity and the masks people wear in social situations, themes that seemed obviously inspired by recent events even. Though she never explicitly acknowledged the connection, the student body's reaction to Sophia's transformation ranged from admiration and curiosity to fear and resentment, creating new social dynamics that were in some ways more complex than the isolation she had previously experienced. Students who had witnessed her harassment without intervention now approached her with expressions of guilt and awkward attempts at friendship that felt motivated more by self-interest than genuine connection. Others maintained careful distance, apparently concerned that casual interactions might somehow trigger the violent capabilities they now knew she possessed. The revelation of Sophia's boxing background had created unexpected ripple effects throughout Clearwater's social hierarchy, as students who had previously felt secure in their positions now questioned whether other seemingly vulnerable classmates might possess hidden capabilities that could threaten their status. The mythology surrounding Sophia's defensive demonstration had grown to include speculation about other transfer students and quiet achievers who might be concealing similar secrets, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty that made traditional bullying tactics seem significantly more risky. Dr. Lisa Chun's discovery of her daughter's revealed identity came through a carefully worded phone call from the school's guidance counselor, who had been tasked with managing the administrative implications of the gymnasium incident. The conversation required delicate navigation of confidentiality policies and liability concerns, while ensuring that Sophia's parents understood the changed circumstances at school. Dr. Chun's reaction combined relief that her daughter's ordeal was over with frustration that their strategy of concealment had actually exposed Sophia to the very problems they had hoped to avoid. The family discussion that followed Dr. Chun's conversation with the school administration represented a fundamental reassessment of the decisions that had shaped Sophia's experience at Clearwater Academy. Marcus Chun's perspective as a former competitive boxer provided insight into the psychological toll that denying one's athletic identity could create, while Dr. Chen's medical training helped her understand the stress symptoms that Sophia had been exhibiting for months. The recognition that their well-intentioned protective strategy had backfired so completely forced both parents to acknowledge the limitations of their understanding about adolescent social dynamics. Sophia's relationship with her family was transformed by the open acknowledgement of what she had endured and accomplished during her months at Clearwater Academy, as the artificial barriers between her public and private identities were finally removed. The pride that her parents felt in her restraint and ultimate defensive success was tempered by guilt about having placed her in an impossible situation through their insistence on secrecy. The family's evening discussions now included honest conversations about boxing, competition, and the role that athletic achievement should play in Sophia's academic and social development. The search for a suitable boxing gym had taken on new urgency and importance following Sophia's revelation, as her parents recognized that denying her access to training and competition had created psychological pressure that contributed to the difficulties she faced at school. The investigation of local facilities became a family project that included consideration of factors like coaching philosophy, training partners, and competitive opportunities that would allow Sophia to resume the athletic development that had been interrupted by their relocation to the Pacific Northwest. Trevor's private conversations with his parents about the gymnasium incident had forced the Blackwood family to confront uncomfortable truths about the values and behaviors they had inadvertently encouraged through their emphasis on dominance and social positioning. Richard Blackwood's legal background provided him with a clear understanding of how close his son had come to facing serious criminal charges for attempted assault, while the family's social connections at Clearwater Academy were strained by the embarrassment of Trevor's public humiliation and obvious moral failure. Madison's family dynamics had been complicated by her parents' discovery that their daughter's sophisticated social manipulation skills had been directed toward systematic harassment rather than the positive leadership they had assumed she was demonstrating. The Pierce family's real estate empire had been built on understanding market dynamics and human psychology, but they struggled to comprehend how their daughter's abilities had been corrupted into cruelty that could have resulted in serious legal and social consequences for their family's reputation. Connor's parents faced the additional challenge of reconciling their son's participation in harassment campaigns with the values of hard work and respect for others that had guided their families rise from working-class origins to their current prosperity. The disconnect between Connor's athletic training, which emphasized honor and fair competition, and his willingness to participate in systematic bullying created cognitive dissonance that forced the Walsh family to examine whether their pursuit of social acceptance had compromised their fundamental principles. The administrative response to the gymnasium incident required careful balancing of multiple competing interests, as Clearwater Academy's leadership struggled to address the harassment campaign without creating liability exposure or damaging relationships with influential families. The school's zero-tolerance policies seemed inadequate for handling a situation where the victim had ultimately defended herself successfully, while the revelation that systematic bullying had continued undetected for months raised questions about supervisory effectiveness that could have broader implications for the institution's reputation. The long-term implications of Sophia's revelation extended far beyond the immediate participants in the harassment campaign, as her demonstration of hidden capabilities created lasting changes in Clearwater Academy's social environment that would influence student interactions for years to come. The knowledge that quiet students might possess unexpected abilities to defend themselves had fundamentally altered the risk calculations that governed bullying behavior, while Sophia's restraint and ultimate defensive success had provided a model for how physical capability could be combined with moral responsibility. The transformation was complete, irreversible, and had created a new equilibrium at Clearwater Academy where Sophia Chen was no longer the invisible target she had been for months, but rather a respected figure whose combination of academic excellence and athletic achievement represented the kind of well-rounded success that the institution claimed to promote. The journey from harassment victim to empowered student had revealed important truths about character, capability, and the complex relationship between strength and restraint that would influence not only Sophia's remaining time at Clearwater, but the experiences of countless other students who would benefit from the changed social dynamics her courage had created. 6 months later, Sophia stood in the center of a boxing ring at the Pacific Northwest Regional Championships, her hands raised in victory as the referee announced her 4th national title. In the audience, Trevor, Madison, and Connor watched with genuine admiration, their transformation as complete as hers had been. Trevor had channeled his leadership abilities into organizing anti-bullying programs, while Madison used her social skills to mentor struggling students. Connor had become Sophia's occasional sparring partner, his wrestling background complementing her boxing in ways that made both athletes better. The gym had become a sanctuary where former enemies trained side by side, proving that redemption was possible when people chose growth over pride. Sophia's parents watched from ringside, finally understanding that hiding strength never protects anyone, it only delays the inevitable moment when character must be revealed. Dr. Chen had established a sports medicine clinic specializing in young athletes, while Marcus returned to coaching, using his daughter's story to teach the next generation about the difference between power and violence, between strength and brutality. Clearwater Academy had become a different place entirely, where academic excellence and athletic achievement were celebrated equally, and where students understood that true strength meant protecting others rather than exploiting their weaknesses. As Sophia held her championship trophy, she thought about her grandfather's teachings, that fighting was a conversation conducted with respect, that victory should humble rather than corrupt, and that the greatest battles were often won through restraint rather than force. The quiet girl, who had hidden her light for so long, now shone brightly, illuminating the path for others who struggled to find their place in an often cruel world. If you enjoyed this story of transformation and redemption, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of courage, resilience, and the power of standing up for what's right. Your support helps us share stories that matter.